Song of Solomon, chapter 6. And we actually might, let's see. Okay, yeah, we'll start. We're just going to read the whole chapter. All right, Song of Solomon 6. Where has your lover gone, O most beautiful among women? Where has your lover turned so we may seek him with you? My lover went down to his garden, to the beds of balsam, to graze his flocks in the garden, and to gather lilies. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. He browses among the lilies. You are beautiful, my darling, like Tirzah, lovely as Jerusalem, awesome as an army with banners. Turn your eyes away from me, for they overwhelm me. Your hair is like a flock of ewe-goats descending down from Gilead. Your teeth are like a flock of ewes that have come up from the washing. Each of them has a twin, and none among them is missing. Your temple, sorry, I'm missing a slide there. Your temple is like a slice of pomegranate behind your veil. There are 60 queens, 80 concubines, and young women beyond number. Yet my dove, my perfect one, is unique. She is her mother's only one, a virtuous child of the one who bore her. Maidens saw her and called her blessed. Queens and concubines praised her. Who is this that appears like dawn? As beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, awesome as an army with banners. I went down into the garden of nut trees to look at the fruit of the valley, to see if the vine had budded or the pomegranates had bloomed. Before I was aware, my soul set me among the chariots of my princely people. Amen. So last week, Joseph talked a lot about gardens. In Song of Solomon chapter 5, we kind of talked about how we are a garden unto the Lord. And back in the day, gardens were not just for the public to kind of come in and defile and trample upon, but gardens or springs would be shut up. They'd be sealed. They would be set apart only for the king, predominantly to enjoy. But I want to backtrack a little bit to chapter 5 because there's something important that gets highlighted in chapter 5 specifically, that the Shulamite or the bride, she goes through a season of testing. So she goes through this testing because Jesus comes to her as this suffering servant. He's covered with dew, the drops of the night. And he comes and asks her to open the door for him. And when she gets up to go let him in, he's gone. So she goes looking for him. And in the process, not only can she not find him, she's calling out, he's not answering. But in the midst of all of this, the watchmen or the guards making rounds around the city find her, beat her, take away her veil. And her response to all of that as she says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you should find my lover, what will you tell him? That I am sick from love. I am lovesick." And then she goes on to explain why he's different and why he's better than everyone else, and describes him at length, talking about different aspects and attributes of the beloved. And that's kind of that's how it ends in chapter 5. And that's where we're picking up today in chapter 6. And this is important because the bride has just gone through quite a trial. And all of us at different, points in time will go through trials and testing. And it's interesting because we're starting to get to the point in Song of Solomon where the bride is maturing and growing in love. And all of us, I think, or many of us can attest to this in our own walk with the Lord that we all start off in the faith for different reasons. Some of you guys maybe grew up in church. I did not. I went to youth group with my friend because we thought it would be a good way to meet boys. Like, that's how we started. That's how I started following Jesus. So there's like, there's different aspects as we start coming after the Lord. Oftentimes we're drawn to like, what can God do for me? And how is he going to bless me? How is he going to make my life better? But as we walk with him long enough, our love should start to mature in a way where we realize it's not about me. Like that he doesn't just exist only for me or for my good, for my benefit. Like I exist for him. And we're going to see that the bride is starting to get to that place in love. And I love this verse in 1 Peter 6-8. He says, "In this you rejoice, though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials, so that the tested genuineness of your faith, more precious than gold that perishes, though it is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ. Though you have not seen him, you love him. Though you do not now see him, you believe in him and rejoice with joy that is inexpressible and filled with glory." So Peter talks about there being a tested genuineness of our faith. And this is kind of in chapter 5, that's what we see the bride starting to experience, is she is experiencing a testing that is going to see like how genuine is her walk with the Lord. There's, I think we get to, praise God, like we get to experience this sometimes in our own lives or our relationships with other people, but a lot of us, probably I would guess, especially, like I'm thinking Frank and Sue or Ken and Twee, some of the married couples that have been married longer, like you guys have experienced a tested genuineness of your love. Like there is, there's trials and things that you have walked through that have proven that it is authentic or have shown that it is real. There's even, I can think of seasons in this church. Sometimes it's kind of interesting to me because you'll never see Jeff or Cindy on stage very often. Cindy was joking on Friday. She's like, "All right, I did my annual teaching for the year. Now I'm good for a full another year before I ever have to share again." But they have been through a lot with this spiritual family. And they have had a tested genuineness that I can look at Jeff and Cindy and like, if something happens, I'm like, they'll be fine. Like, I trust that they will not be shaken by certain things because they've been tested and their love has been proven genuine. And that is something that we get to experience with the Lord as well. So we see the bride go through this in this past season. And now we're going to kind of look at like a few different responses. We're going to look at how other people respond to witnessing her go through this season of testing. And then we're also going to look at how does Jesus respond to her going through this testing. So when we look at her worshiping, like in chapter 5, she is worshiping Jesus. She's declaring who he is. And she's saying all of these things about him that she knows to be true and has experienced to be true. And in the midst of of her worship, even in her testing, even in her trial, there's a few people or groups of people that are affected. And the primary one who's affected by our worship is obviously the Lord. But secondarily, our worship also affects, we'll see in some scriptures from the Psalms, our worship affects the humble and our worship also affects the many. And I don't know if this is necessarily the right way to think about it, but kind of just in my plain sense reading of things, I like to think about the humble as being other believers and maybe the many being like people that like maybe aren't walking with the Lord yet, but are witnessing. So we see that like our worship specifically in the midst of trials affects the Lord. And we see this in Psalm 69, where the psalmist is talking about how they're afflicted and in pain, but they will praise the name of God with a song and magnify him with thanksgiving. And it says that this will please the Lord more than an ox or a bull with horns and hoofs. And I think that's just so encouraging to me to think about how when we are afflicted and when we are in pain, when we bring the Lord thanksgiving and when we bring him a song, like it actually means so much more to him than some of these other sacrifices or offerings. Like, what a beautiful thing is that? Because I think sometimes it's easy for us, when we're afflicted or in pain and we bring the Lord something, it often feels very weak. And we don't necessarily feel in that moment how it's affecting his heart. But to see in the scriptures like that it really, really moves him, should greatly like encourage and comfort us. The second group of people we talked about is the humble. So in Psalm 34, when we bless him, when his praise is in our mouth, our soul makes its boast in him, the humble hear that and they're glad. So it affects other people as well. Our worship is a witness. And then in Psalm 40, we get another picture of a very desperate situation. Somebody's in the pit of destruction, a miry bog. God delivers him, puts a new song in his mouth, a song of praise to God. And it says, many. So here's the many. Many will see and fear and put their trust in the Lord. So this is interesting because there's actually, when we walk through trials and we're still praising God, like in the midst of suffering, like it causes people to marvel. And I think one of the, a fresh example probably for all of us is like a lot of us look at G. A week or two ago, G is up here like dancing and praising the Lord, and every bone in her body has got to be just screaming in pain. But she still has a song in her mouth. And when people see that, it causes them to wonder. I tell G all the time, I'm like, G, you are a sign and a wonder. Because I see people in the hospital all the time that are in pain, and they don't look like her. They look angry or upset or sad or depressed or withdrawn. Like they don't look full of joy and full of thanksgiving. That takes the Holy Spirit. But all of this to say is that our worship has an effect on God's heart and on other people's hearts. That when we see each other going through trials and tribulations and still going on about how our beloved is amazing, he's better than any other, it really causes people to wonder. And we see this in the daughters of Jerusalem, because in the next chapter, after the bride does this, they ask her, they're like, where did he go? Like, we want to seek him with you, because she's just gone on about how much better he is than everyone else. And now they want to follow her with him. And it's interesting too, we start to see a shifting here, because the daughters of Jerusalem are now starting to refer to the bride in the same language that the bridegroom had referred to her. And if you guys remember in the beginning of Song of Solomon, like the bride is like, I'm dark but lovely, like, don't look at me, the sun's tanned me, like, I haven't kept my vineyard, like, look away, like, and she starts off like that, but now even people around her are starting to see what God has always seen and what he's always called forth. And I think that's so beautiful. Sometimes, there's people who from maybe one previous season of our lives, like, wouldn't recognize us. Now they're like, wait, you're like, what? Like, who are you, or what are you now? Like, because the Lord has brought forth Christ in us, and they're starting to see her beauty and his beauty. And the bride says something powerful here. She starts saying, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. So she, like we kind of touched on earlier, she's starting to realize that she belongs to Jesus, that she is his inheritance, that we are the Father's gift to Jesus, and that he desires a wholehearted love from us. And this is a really powerful and amazing statement, because most of us, myself included, like when we walk through a season or a situation where you can't feel him, you can't see him, you're crying out to him and he's not answering yet. Like, that doesn't automatically elicit a response of, oh, he loves me. Like, usually, like, somewhere in our immaturity and insecurity, we're like, God, like, are you really good? Do you really love me? Like, we're not rooted quite yet, enough to not question that. But the bride gets to a point where she's maturing in such a way that she is confident, like, whether or not she can see him, hear him, feel him, he's answering, not answering, present, not present, even though she's seeking him, trying to find him, and everybody else is treating her terribly in the process. Like, she's still confident, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. And that's what the Lord wants to root us in, that kind of secure love. So now let's look at how Jesus responds. So we've seen how the daughters of Jerusalem respond. And the bride even, it's interesting because the bride makes a comment. Because they're asking, well, where is he? And she knows, she says in verse 2, my lover went down to his garden, to the beds of balsam, to graze his flocks in the garden and to gather the lilies. Like, it's interesting because in chapter 5, the bride had not, she didn't find him yet. She had not overtaken him or come upon him, but she's confident in where he is because he told her before, hey, you want to find me? Follow in the footsteps of the flock. She knows where he's going to be, and she stays close to the body of Christ. So when we see how Jesus responds to her, it's interesting because he starts telling her, you're beautiful as tears of my love, lovely as Jerusalem, awesome as an army with banners. And this is an interesting thing to see because even though he wasn't present and wasn't with her, how he feels about her never changes. It always stays steady and it always stays consistent throughout the Song of Solomon. What I think one of the most, I'm not going to go through all of this verse by verse, but I want to focus on verse 5 where it says, turn away your eyes from me, for they overwhelm me. Jesus is not overcome by anything. If you think about it, he says, take heart, I have overcome the world. He has destroyed sin. He will destroy death. He's overcome the grave. It talks about how he triumphs over everything, triumphs over his enemies, how God has highly exalted him, given him the name above every other name. And this is the one. He can't be overcome by anything, can't be bought by anything, but he says of us, turn away your eyes from me, for they overwhelm me. That is a very interesting statement for God to make about humans. That's almost it's almost oh my gosh, is that okay? Is that true? Is that, blasphemous? Can you really feel that way about our love? Does our love actually impact and touch your heart that much? And I think one of the, there's something so precious about the way that we love the Lord through trials. And I think this is one of the reasons why God so delights in Jesus and so exalted him and rewarded him. Because if you kind of think about the initial sin in the garden and how man decided to evaluate what was good and evil, including God. They started making their own decisions, their own assessments, their own judgments and evaluations, started, using our eyes and our brains to determine okay, I think this is good and right. Don't think this way is good and right. And even in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus overcomes that original sin. And he says, not my will, but your will be done. Even though everything in front of him is screaming, this is a bad idea, God. Like, I don't think that, I really, really, really don't want to go through with this. Like, if there's any other way, like, please take this cup from me. Please take it. But he's looking at that, pleading with the Father, sweating drops of blood, and he still is obedient unto death on the cross, trusting in his Father, trusting in the one who's able to save and deliver him from death. And how much that must have moved the Father to see the Son walking in that degree or that kind of obedience, that he wasn't walking by his sight, or he was walking in trust in the Father. And we are invited into that same depth of maturity of love for Jesus, in that same degree that we get to walk with him through trials. And even if everything in our natural opinion or senses is like looking at something, we're like, Jesus, I don't like this. I don't think this is a good idea. If there's another way, like, please take this from me. But the fact that we get to respond with love to the Lord in the midst of all kinds of trials. It could be mistreatment from other people, could be being overlooked, could be a season of barrenness in the natural or in the physical, or just spiritually, like we're not bringing forth what we feel the Lord has desired or what he's promised. Like, all kinds of trials and testing, we get to bring and give our love for Jesus that's tested and tried and says, you know what? Though he slay me, yet I trust him. Like, and God, I'm going to love you beyond what you can benefit me and beyond what you can give to me. It was kind of interesting. The first time I traveled around the world with Priscilla, when we were going around the world for probably, like maybe 2 months or so, we were going to be traveling. We were going to start off in Europe, and then we were going to Israel, and then we were going to do a mission trip in China. It was a long trip, and I had never traveled with her for that long. And I remember distinctly one of our friend's sisters saw us right before we flew out, and she looks at us and she's like, I think you guys will make it. And that was I was like, huh? Like, what do you mean we'll make it? Like, that was the first that had occurred to me, that our friendship might not survive that trip. That after you spend so much time with somebody, it's either going to get closer or you're going to not like each other very much by the end of it. And that was the first that thought had crossed my mind. But our friendship was tested and tried during that trip. There was a time when we got stuck. Long story short, we got stuck overnight in a train station in Venice, Italy. And it was a very remote train station. Looking back in hindsight, I'm like, man, the Lord protected us, because that was not a good situation. But no one is there, middle of the night. We're sleeping in this train station. I'm wearing all of my clothes, all of her jackets. And Priscilla, unbeknownst to me, when I was sleeping in the middle of the night, was fending off cockroaches with her shoe. And I think about situations like that during our trip, and I'm like, yeah, after things like that, I don't doubt that her love for me is selfless, or I don't doubt her ability or desire to lay down her life for her friends, because it's been tested. And there's some seasons that we also will go through that the Lord brings us through a testing for the sake of our love and our faith being proved genuine. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we've done something wrong, but it is a part of our walking with him. And I love just kind of one of the ways he describes the bride. It says, who is this who looks down like the dawn, beautiful as the moon, bright as the sun, awesome as an army with banners? And it's interesting because the bride is being described as shining like the sun or like the moon. And that's a description that is typically reserved for Jesus. Jesus is usually the one that's described. It says his face was like the sun shining in full strength. Or, he goes up to the Mount of Transfiguration. It says his face shone like the sun. But we see other instances in scriptures where Moses comes down and everyone's freaked out because he's radiating from the glory of God from having been in his presence. And that's kind of this description that we get of the bride here, that she is, she's just been beat up, battered. She can't feel his presence, can't find God. Like, she's trying to seek him. And this is the way that he describes her. Like, awesome as an army with banners. She's shining and radiating the glory of God back to him. She's reflecting the glory of Jesus. And she's walking in a victory. And it might not, I think sometimes it feels very weak to us. But often, like it says, that his power is made perfect in our weakness. And so the bride, maybe doesn't even, who knows if she feels it or not in this season, but the way that the Lord receives and describes her love is pretty amazing. So I want to take a little time now to go into a response. And I think one thing I didn't kind of touch on earlier, but sometimes I think especially in our culture, there is such a value or a pressure on being genuine and authentic to how we feel, that sometimes we almost feel like if we worship the Lord when we're not feeling it, that's being inauthentic or it's not being real. But actually, in the scriptures, we see that is a good and a right response, that our worship is not based on our feeling. Our worship isn't based on how we're doing, if we're doing well, if we're going through trials. It's actually based on who he is. And he doesn't change, so we can always worship. And that's what we see the bride doing, and that's what we get invited into. So, sorry, that was a little tangent, just throwing that in because I forgot it. But I do want to take some time to pray. And I want to pray, I think, for two primary things. And one is just that the Lord would give us that same kind of confidence in the midst of trials and in the midst of testing, that whether we can or can't feel his presence, that we would confidently say, I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine. That we would remain steady and confident in his love. And the second is just that the Lord would give our hearts grace to respond well to him in trials, that our response would be worship. So confidence in his love and that he does not change, and just grace that we would respond well to him in the midst of testing. So with those two things in mind, I want us to spend a little time praying with and for each other. So if you guys can kind of turn to a friend or a neighbor around you, maybe just share which one of those things you want them to pray for you. Trust in his goodness, trust in who he is in the midst of trials, or responding in worship to him no matter what we're going through. So